You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should Europe adopt the death penalty? On Tuesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged all European countries to ban the death penalty. His comments came after two men who were convicted of a subway bombing in the Belarus capital Minsk last year were executed over the weekend. The executions have been condemned by many senior politicians across Europe, with some independent reports raising serious and credible concerns over the standard of evidence and fairness of the trial of the two men. And following the tragic shooting of the three children, among others at a French school on Monday, there have been calls for the death penalty to be reinstated in the country. France's far-right party leader Marine Le Pen has previously called for the death penalty in France for child killers. I'm joined in the studio by Heather McGill, who's from Amnesty International and who's researched the death penalty in Belarus and written Amnesty's report on the subject in 2009, David Flint, who's the chairman of the North London Humanist Group, and Timothy Stanley, a historian and writer at Oxford University and a blogger for the Daily Telegraph website. And joining me on the phone is Pavel Potapieko, who's an expert at the Information and Analysis Centre under the administration of the President of Belarus. Thank you all for coming. So I'd first like to ask you all briefly, should the state have the right to kill? Timothy?
I don't like the word right, because it implies the state has authority over the individual in all circumstances. I prefer the word option. I think it should be an option. I would say the death penalty is a tragic necessity. No one wants it. I think it's necessary in some cases to deter the very worst of crimes. It's necessary sometimes to bring about full justice. It doesn't always happen under the best of circumstances, and it's not always the very best regimes that do it. But just because someone's government is corrupt, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person should be denied full justice.
Heather?
I think that states should not kill. I think that Amnesty International always sympathises with the victims of crime. Of course, we understand that. And we sympathise with the victims of the terrible event in the Minsk metro in April. However, to compound the suffering of those relatives with the death of other people, we do not think is an answer to crime. It's been proven that the death penalty is not a deterrent. If we look at those countries with the death penalty, we see high levels of crime. If we look at the United States, within one country, we can compare the situation in those states that have the death penalty and those that don't. And it is those states with high levels of crime that have the death penalty. I think also that the death penalty always carries with it the danger of killing an innocent person. And I think for me that's the most terrible argument. And here in Belarus, we see two men who've been executed for a crime, a terrible crime. Yet the trial has been surrounded with questions. It's been surrounded with emotions. And that is the danger, that crimes that carry the death penalty are extremely emotional crimes. And in this environment of high emotions is when mistakes most often happen.
David?
The nature of a state is that it is an organisation that uses violence. I cannot imagine a state which doesn't have the power to kill, whether by civilian means or by military means. But that said, if we're talking about the death penalty used in a civilian context, used to execute people deemed guilty of some crime, then I'm with Heather. I think it's wrong. What we see with the abolition of the death penalty, and it's important to recognise that the trend to reduce the death penalty runs over centuries and most of the world, goes in step with other humanitarian measures like the abolition of judicial torture earlier. What we see of that is a general long-term civilizing process. We're going through that process. It's incomplete. We should be going forward with that process and not back.
And Pavel?
The death penalty was voted by our people on referendum. To abolish it, we have to keep another referendum. Otherwise, we would violate our legislation. If we take some polls into account, for instance, public opinion polls, we will see that up to 80% of our population support the death penalty. And it is maybe no surprise because, of course, this question is quite emotional. It doesn't mean that we use death penalty here and there, everywhere. However, every case should be investigated so thoroughly as it is only possible.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should Europe adopt the death penalty? That brings me on to my next question, actually, quite nicely. Heather, a YouGov poll from September in 2010 asked people in Britain directly, if they wanted the death penalty reinstated. Now, 51% were in favour of this. In a democracy, shouldn't the majority have their way?
I think there are some questions on which the government takes the lead. And as Pavel rightly said, this is an emotional issue. And for that reason, I think that one must take the lead and show the way. It's not surprising that people will say they want the death penalty. They generally think about horrible crimes, but what they don't think about is what is being done in their name as a citizen. How is this being carried out? For instance, in Belarus, people simply don't know because it's all shrouded in mystery. They don't know the fact that relatives are not told that they're going to be that their loved ones are going to be executed. They don't know. The prisoners themselves don't know that they're about to be executed. I think if people knew these details, they might think a little differently about it. And in fact, it's the government's responsibility to give this full information so that people can make an informed choice about whether they want the state to do this or not. I would like just to say that in Belarus, there was a constitutional court decision in 2004 which said that the death penalty was not constitutional and that it could be abolished by parliament and the president. So that option is available in Belarus.
Timothy?
I think if you live in a democracy, you have to play by the rules of democracy. If the people want something, then one's legal institutions have to reflect that. I don't think that legal institutions, judges, courts should attempt to shape the morality of the people. I think the people should shape their decisions. What I would ask is, for whom does the justice system exist? Does it exist to protect the rights of the criminals? Does it exist to provide justice to the people? If the people see a great transgression taking place, I think it's absolutely right in a democracy that the legal system should step in to act in their interests. I do agree with Heather. Whenever that question is asked, do you want the death penalty back? It's always after a terrible crime. So whenever you ask the question, ipso facto, people always say, yes, I'm in favour of it. Public opinion does go up and down on the issue. That's undeniable. But I think in this debate, too often, we have a concern for what is one person's concept of morality, as in the death penalty is murder, it is wrong, versus the general popular will. And something that concerns me about Western justice is I think it has become separated from democracy, separated from the popular will, and no longer is reflective of people's needs or desires. And when that happens, people lose faith in the justice system, and that can lead to vigilantism, it can lead to greater crime, it can lead to social anarchy.
David, your response to that?
My response to that, I think, is that that I see the humanisation process, the civilising process, as a process going forward. That means that it isn't a matter, in my view, of the people, whoever the people may be, instructing the legislators. It's more of a dynamic. It's more of a dynamic between the people to whom we have voted power, the people at large, the people with genuine expertise in a field. And I think this applies not just to issues of death and crime and punishment, but to a whole range of things where there is this necessary interplay between expertise, authority, and ultimate sovereignty, which must lie with the people.
Where does the authority for the application of that expertise come from?
It comes ultimately from the people.
The people, right.
But expressed in our system through Parliament.
Parliament has not had a vote on this for some time. We all know that the people in Parliament tend to have diametrically opposite views to their constituents. I would say that's a reflection of how broken our representative democracy is, that this issue isn't more frequently discussed. But nonetheless, I accept the point. Authority for social change should come from the people.
But we have a real issue here, which is that I notice that when there is a demand that the popular will, as measured through opinion polls, should dominate, it's always in the context of a very small number of issues. Mm-hmm. Now, I would be prepared, I guess, to sign up to having the people decide everything. It would turn out that the death penalty was a rather small part of the total politics, as it is now. The shape of politics would be very different.
In Britain, the principle has always been that you're judged by your peers. And the problem is if you rule out the death penalty, you remove one facet of judgment-making on the part of your peers. There's one thing they cannot do. And that, to me, reflects the ways in which our legal and justice system has become imprisoned by a liberal morality, which is quite separate from the purpose of the justice system, which is to bring social order and also to reflect the will of the people in the court.
Do you want to see the world in all of its diversity? Listen to one of the oldest radio stations in the world, the Voice of Russia, and you'll gain a comprehensive understanding of the most important world events.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should Europe adopt the death penalty? I'm joined in the studio by Heather McGill, who's from Amnesty International and who's researched the death penalty in Belarus and written Amnesty's report on the subject in 2009, David Flint, who's the chairman of the North London Humanist Group, and Timothy Stanley, a historian and writer at Oxford University and a blogger for the Daily Telegraph website. And joining me on the phone is Pavel Potapieko, who's an expert at the Information and Analysis Centre under the administration of the President of Belarus. Pavel mentioned a referendum in Belarus. Would you advocate a referendum in Britain on the death penalty?
I'm generally uncomfortable about referenda because if you have one, you have to have one on absolutely everything. And for that reason, I don't think it's necessary. I would rather instead that people lobbied their MPs. It's extraordinary that we have a sort of conservative government, but this isn't really an issue. And I think that reflects the degree to which members of Parliament in Great Britain are quite socially and culturally distanced from their own constituents, and quite often from their own party members as well.
I'd like to ask you, I mean, you've blogged for the Daily Telegraph website before about the death penalty. Is there a danger that media hype exacerbates these calls for the death penalty? I think you touched briefly on that. I mean, take, for example, the media attention over the Soham murders.
Right, yeah. I'd agree with that. There's no denying that the media chooses the cases that it wishes to talk about. There's no denying that if a sensational story is there, it's going to move people's emotions, especially when a child is involved, or if a large number of people are involved, as in Belarus, if there's a terrorist attack. That, to me, doesn't mean that you have to suspend justice just because the media is fickle. I would also put it to you that the media does the opposite. When many years have passed and the death penalty comes up, when the guilty person is facing it, you'll suddenly find the media are against the death penalty. And we saw that in America during the Troy Davis case. You see an extraordinary 180 in popular and public attitudes, whereby they will be screaming for the death penalty when the crime is being committed, but give it a couple of years down the line and suddenly you'll hear all about how the guilty person has a family, how he's found God, how he may not have done it because a new piece of evidence has come up. So I would argue that that's simply a function of how terribly fickle the media is and the fact that it chases stories. That doesn't change the fact that I think the justice system should provide full justice to people if that's how they define full justice.
David, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I come back to something Tim was saying about the way in which the political elite has become separated from the mass of the country. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, I'm a bit older than you, Tim. I remember the law reforms of the 1960s. Divorce, homosexuality, race relations, all things in which a lead was taken on things which we now look back on and say, well, of course it was right to make those changes. The death penalty was one of those things. You remember we abolished the death penalty in that period. Some of those things have continued to be controversial to some extent. But I think it's right that people should be able to follow legislators in this case, should be able to follow their conscience, give a lead in the civilizing process. If the lead goes too far, then your position becomes correct. They will alienate the base and lose connection. So it's a matter of how far ahead of the mass of the people we can go.
I just reject, from the principle of representative democracy, I reject the idea that the elite should teach or lead. I just don't accept that. I have to disagree with your definition of human progress. Society doesn't move entirely wiggishly in one direction towards democracy and liberalism and progressivism. There are progressive moments, there are conservative moments throughout history. You do see fluctuations in human progress, and sometimes what that's about is liberalism going too far and then there being a backlash. And that's what I suspect is happening in the British justice system. It's why law has gotten tougher and in some cases a little more arbitrary and unfair in the last 10 years or so in Britain, because people are responding against many of the legal reforms of the 1960s.
Heather, I'd like to ask you, is it ever a case of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? What a person that takes away life should be given the same treatment. Is there ever a case for that?
I don't think there is, because how can you really be sure that you've got the right person? I think that's a big question. In the United States, since the 1970s, over 130 people have been exonerated on death row. So those are 130 people who were already sentenced to death. And then it turns out that, no, they had the wrong guy. So I think that is very difficult. If you can't guarantee that in the United States, that you're always going to get the right man, then no, you shouldn't work by that rule.
If that is true, then following that logic, one's entire legal system breaks down. Because if you believe that courts could very well be wrong, then how can you sentence anyone? You have to have faith in the judicial system that it's worked. Otherwise, the entire principle of Western law just collapses and we have to let everyone out of prison.
Yeah, but at least they're not dead, you see. The problem with the death penalty is that there's no going back once you've done it. And there are cases in Belarus in Soviet times when they had a Chikatilo case of a mass murderer, and they did actually execute several people before they found who they claimed was the real culprit. So I think it's the inexorable nature of the death penalty, the fact that you can't undo it once it's done, is the problem.
Pavel.
We really mentioned, for instance, the case of Chikatilo, for example, when he didn't think about mercy to his victims, and then people who defend human rights think about his feelings as a person who is sentenced to death. However, it is not revenge, it is not vendetta, not just to think about the feelings of mass murderer and not to evaluate the sufferings of his victims.
Heather?
Yes, of course, one always sympathise with the victims. I'd like to say that during the trial in Minsk, the relatives of the victims, some of them expressed doubts about the fact that these were the men who had in fact killed or injured their family members. They were not convinced by the evidence brought in court. They themselves feared that the wrong people may have been sentenced in this case. So it's not a question of not sympathising with the victims. And when I say about the danger of executing the wrong person, my sympathies certainly are not with the mass murderers, but with those who may have been executed by mistake.
You know, this issue is one of the most often raised because there is a lot of discussion about whether it was, a real investigation or not. I would assure you everything was, very thoroughful, very careful. These criminal actions were filmed. I would say politically motivated rumors about how, that's a kind of, I would say, conspiracy theory. The investigation was absolutely professional and very profound. I'm
not interested in conspiracy theories, but for instance, Vladislav Kovalyov initially confessed, and this confession was extracted extremely quickly within 24 hours of the event. And then he retracted that confession and said that he did it because he had been beaten and because he feared torture. And he said that he heard the screams of Dmitry Konovalov and that he feared he would also be tortured. We also know that an ambulance was called out several times during the interrogation. So it's fears of an unfair trial that makes us doubt this verdict, fears that this was very quickly solved, this crime, and these men were extremely quickly executed.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should Europe adopt the death penalty? I'm joined in the studio by Heather McGill, who's from Amnesty International and who's researched the death penalty in Belarus and written Amnesty's report on the subject in 2009, David Flint, who's the chairman of the North London Humanist Group, and Timothy Stanley, a historian and writer at Oxford University and a blogger for the Daily Telegraph website. And joining me on the phone is Pavel Potapieko, who's an expert at the Information and Analysis Centre under the administration of the President of Belarus. Is there any evidence that countries which have the death penalty have reduced murder rates?
There is, yes. If you look at America, it is true that the death penalty is found in states where the rate of crime is at its highest, but that's precisely because it was introduced where it was felt to be necessary. Between 1968 and 1976, the United States suspended use of the death penalty across the entire country. After 1976, several states reintroduced it. They saw an overall fall in the rate of murder of 32%. The author of Freakonomics calculated that for an increase of 71 executions in total from 1990 to 2000, roughly 9,000 murders less occurred. There is, in most studies, a link proven between reintroduction of the death penalty and a decline in the murder rate.
OK, well, let's just get all of your final thoughts. So I'll start with you, Heather, please.
I don't believe that. I mean, one can manipulate statistics, and I don't believe that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on crime. If one looks at the types of crimes that carry the death penalty, they're normally murder. Most murders are committed in intimate circumstances, in the family, in states of high emotion. It's extremely unlikely that a person who is driven to such a height of emotion that he's about to kill someone will then calculate, but this will, I will be killed for this, therefore I'm not going to commit this act. It's extremely unlikely that it will actually deter an individual.
David?
The whole criminal justice system exists to produce certain results in society having to do with good order and peace and things like that. But it's only one means. In management, which is my own background, we've learned over the years that in most cases, the right question for dealing with a problem is not to say who is responsible, but rather how did this happen. It's convenient to the authorities to ask the who question, whether it is the British government in the wake of the riots or tyrannical governments faced with social unrest and acts of terrorism. But that doesn't make it the best question to ask. Asking how we got into this situation, and therefore what we might need to do to change to get out of it, is almost certainly the better long-term question, and the question which moves us towards a better society.
Pavel?
I would concentrate on, first of all, legality of criminal punishment, because, the humanity is humanized, let's say, and more and more civilized. And, of course, there is a trend of abolishing death penalty. And I hope one day, and this day will come quite soon, I think, death penalty will be out of use. But, however, up to now, we can see a lot of things that, could not be punished other way than using capital punishment.
Tim?
We do know that while the death penalty does not deter people who commit crimes of passion, it does, for example, deter people from using a gun in an ordinary crime. So it stops those sorts of crimes occurring. What I would say in summary is that I share Heather's concern about human rights. There are some states in the world which have abominable death penalty practices. In Dubai, you're not allowed to see a lawyer until after a verdict has pretty much been passed. So I am very concerned by the death penalty. It disturbs me. On the other hand, we mentioned Chikatilo earlier. This is a man who raped and murdered dozens of children. And when you read about that, I want him to die. I feel he has stained his soul, and I feel he has degraded humanity, and he has caused such incredible suffering that the only fully just thing to do is for this man to die. And I think that most Russians would have agreed with me, and I think if a justice system is to be truly democratic and represent the needs of the people like that, the option of death penalty should be available.
You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and joining me in this discussion was Heather McGill from Amnesty International, who's researched the death penalty in Belarus and written Amnesty's report on the subject in 2009, David Flint, who's the chairman of the North London Humanist Group, and Timothy Stanley, who's a historian and writer at Oxford University and a blogger for the Daily Telegraph website. And joining me on the phone was Pavel Potapieko, an expert at the Information and Analysis Centre under the administration of the President of Belarus. Stay tuned, we'll be back after the news.